G'day. So I'd like to welcome you all to a presentation today on facilitating consenting and deployment of marine energy devices through risk retirement by Andrea Copping, who heads up some activities in the US that I'll get to in a sec. But first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and sea country we meet on today and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Here in Hobart, this is the traditional and original owners of the land, the Muanina people. I pay respect to those that have passed before us and to acknowledge today's Tasmanian Aboriginal community who are the custodians of this land. So today we're going to hear about a process to make sure that deployments are still sustainable, but to help ease getting things into the water, because we can recognise risks that aren't really a risk, so to speak. So if you could hit the next slide for me, please, Leslie. Obviously, we've got a huge number of partners, many of which will be interested into this topic, both from the engineering side, but actually also from the deployment side. Next slide, please, Leslie. And across all of those different partners, I think there's reaching out into that international space to think about what we can learn from overseas is a great part of being a part of the Blue Economy CRC, which is trying to get that co-location between aquaculture and energy. So it's my pleasure today to introduce Andrea, who's with the Pacific, both with the University of Washington, but also the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, which is under the US Department of Energy. I know Andrea because she leads up a body of work that I'm involved in, where she looks at what are the environmental effects of marine energy development around the world, which is under the auspices of the IEA Ocean Energy Systems. And that's also, she also leads research programs around energy devices to power the blue economy. So rather than go on and belabor the point, I think Andrea can best speak for herself. So welcome, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Beth. And let me get this right before I do anything else. Come on. Okay, thank you so much for inviting me here. This is a real treat. It just dawned on me finally. I can't really say good evening, good morning. Now I understand why everyone in Australia says good day, because it's so confusing across hemispheres and lines of longitude. In any case, I'm very pleased to be here today to talk about this topic. I am representing Pacific Northwest National Laboratory and University of Washington, but also Ocean Energy Systems Environmental, that I'll tell you about in a little bit. Today, what I want to do is touch briefly on marine energy and offshore wind. I want to talk about why we study environmental effects, introduce you to OES Environmental, focus a lot on marine energy stressors and receptors, and get to this topic we call risk retirement. And finally, end up telling you where we are and where we're heading towards. So for many of you, this is the old hat. But marine energy, of course, is energy harvested from ocean water, ocean waves, tides, currents, also salinity and temperature gradients. We also toss in energy from large rivers, not with dams and hydro, but rather run-of-the-river devices. This industry is in the early stages of development and very early commercialization stages, but it is poised to join the energy portfolio that provides for climate change mitigation, provides energy security, especially for remote communities, and also economic development and jobs. Now, offshore wind, the sea-based mounted, stuck in the bottom, is much more established, especially in Europe and Asia. Floating wind on the platforms is really in the early stages, much like with marine energy, but is in the same position to really contribute to this renewable energy portfolio. You have a couple of a tidal device on the left, a wave device in the middle, and the right-hand picture is the variety of floating platforms that wind is being developed on at the moment. Okay, so why do we consider studying environmental effects? What's the big deal? We know what the drivers for creating ocean energy are. I've just mentioned them, but stakeholders and regulators have concerns. And in many of the countries, I'd say most, the regulatory processes are not well established. It's not clear what developers have to do. The concerns of stakeholders and regulators are driven by a number of factors. These are new and unknown technologies, and we don't know what the potential for harm to the environment might be. We don't have enough knowledge about the environments in the ocean, those high energy areas where we want to deploy, because as an oceanographer, I stay out of places like that. They're too rough. We're also making new use of ocean space, but there's many other users already there: fishing, shipping, recreation. And many of the marine species we worry about with these new devices are already under stress from other human activities and from climate change. But if we can understand the state of the science, we can help inform regulators and their advisors about the potential risks of these installations. And we can also help developers as they engineer, design, site, and operate these devices so that they minimize the impacts. So this is the driving force. But how do we do this? If we do it properly, we will shorten and simplify times to consent and deployment. We will do this by decreasing scientific uncertainty, and we'll really clarify what are real risks versus those that are perceived risks. And probably the best way to do this is share information internationally. This is too big a job for any one country. It's a multinational industry, so we really do need to cooperate. Speaking of which, Ocean Energy Systems International is the a conglomerate, a group of 25 countries that are developing marine energy around the world. And I need to tell you that offshore wind and wind in general is not included in this group. There is a separate International Energy Agency group called WIND that deals with that. So much of what I will talk about will be marine energy, but I want to really point out where it applies to wind. Under OES, there is an initiative called OES Environmental that looks at coordinating research and information that will allow us to deploy responsibly. We have 16 of those nations participating now, including Australia, and they're listed there. The US is the lead for this particular task, the US Department of Energy and other federal partners. And my laboratory, Pacific Northwest National Lab, implements this program for the US. One of the big tasks that OES Environmental does every 4 years is create a state of the science report. And we just delivered our most recent report last September. And I am pretty confident that as of September, this was the most up-to-date compilation of scientific research and evidence that exists in the world. It's a big report. The URL is down at the bottom on our TETHIS website. You may want to read all 300 pages, but if not, there are some smaller executive summaries and other small summary sheets you can find there as well. But I think it is a pretty good resource if you're looking for a quick look at what we know. And also, for those of you not already aware of it, my organization also runs an online knowledge base we call TETHIS, and this hosts documents. It has, boy, there's an extra zero in there. It has 6,800, not 1,000, papers and reports and so on it. And it also hosts a lot of the other events that we produce, webinars and other kinds of information. And our biweekly TETHIS Blast is a newsletter you get by email. If you're not signed up for it, please go to TETHIS and do so. You'll find out what's new on the site, news and information from the industry, and other sorts of connections. Okay, so let's get down to the real meat of this. Let's talk about environmental effects of marine energy and offshore wind. We organize this around what we call stressors and receptors, where stressors are those parts of the devices or the systems that may cause harm to the marine environment, harm, injury, death. And those stressors act on receptors, which are the marine animals, the habitats, the ecosystem processes, and the oceanographic processes. After about 10 years of work, the research community has come down to where there are 7 priority stressors. We've managed to eliminate some others. The first of these is collision risk, the risk to animals of a turning tidal blade underwater, or in the case of wind, it's obviously birds and bats at risk from the rotor, from the turbine of the wind tower. Underwater noise coming from the devices underwater. This applies to marine energy only, obviously, but not the pile driving installation noise, but rather the operational noise. We've looked at the risk of electromagnetic fields coming from cables. We've looked at changes to habitats, both benthic habitats and pelagic habitats. Any floating device like a wind platform, offshore wind platform, or a surface mounted wave device will have mooring lines, and there are concerns that large marine mammals could become entangled in these. We've looked at changes in oceanographic systems, that is changing circulation, lowering wave heights, and so on. And the last one is displacement or barrier effects. Now I'm going to talk about each one of these with the exception of displacement and barrier effects. The interaction here really is what will or may occur when we have many devices, lines of wind turbines, big arrays of wave devices that cause migratory species to go out and around and miss out on their preferred habitats. They are kept from them or they are displaced. We have no research on these for obvious reasons. There simply aren't enough devices in the water yet, but that is something we'll keep an eye on in future. But in the meantime, I want to talk about these other 6 stressors. First of all, collision risk around turbines. This interaction happens with tidal turbines or river turbines. It's also acting obviously at the rotor of a wind turbine, but a little bit differently in air. In the water, we're concerned about marine mammals, about fish, diving seabirds. In the tropics, it could be sea turtles as well. For offshore wind, obviously, it's birds, seabirds, and in some cases where we have bats offshore. Now, what this video you see is actually from the Voith turbine that was deployed at the European Marine Energy Centre in the north of Scotland a while ago. That's it on the barge in the lower right. And I'm showing you this really so you get a sense of, first of all, how slowly those blades are turning. And you also see the little fish that don't seem particularly bothered by it. Also a nice view of some biofouling there. We don't have good information here because it's very hard to work in these circumstances. So in many cases, what we need to do is understand what animals might be in the area of the devices and therefore at risk, and whether they can sense and evade the devices. So what do we actually know about this kind of interaction? We haven't had very many observations of animals around turbines because they're very difficult working circumstances. The technologies to monitor them are not well developed. They're hard environments. And if you're collecting particularly video data, it's a huge amount of data to go through. We are not as far along as we'd like to be with machine learning and AI to help with this, but we are working in that area. We do have a series of collision risk and encounter risk numerical models, both for wind and for underwater turbines. They're not great, not entirely fit for purpose, and they haven't been validated, but they're what we have. So on the right, we have what we call our dashboard, and you'll see several of these. The dial is simply trying to put across what the perceived risk of this encounter is at the moment. Red being a very high risk, green much lower risk. We can consider a collision risk to be quite a high risk for 2 reasons. First of all, it's very uncertain whether the collisions are likely to occur, the probability. But if a collision were to occur, the consequences could be quite dire. And this is particularly in small populations, say a marine mammal population that is endangered. Even the loss of 1 or 2 reproductive adults can have a huge impact on the population. Underneath, you see these gray bars, and this is our, on a relative scale, our way of conveying what has to happen to decrease that uncertainty and maybe bring that risk factor down as we understand it. We need to share the information we have better. We need to improve our models. We need more monitoring data to validate models, and there's still a considerable research task ahead of us. So this is really our toughest one to address. Next, we have the risk from underwater noise. We care about this because in the water, marine animals use sound to communicate and navigate, much the way terrestrial mammals and humans use sight and light. And there are many other anthropogenic sounds in the ocean to which these devices will simply add. These are concerns particularly for marine mammals and certain species of fish. For very high volume noises, such as pile driving, there can be physical harm to animals underwater. This is not generally a problem in the marine renewable wave and tidal industry or for floating wind, but at bottom-based wind, it very much is a problem. So what do we actually know? We know that from marine energy devices and the operation of offshore wind, there's unlikely to be physical harm. There may be some behavioral changes, but these are really costly and difficult to investigate. We're very lucky in some ways. In the last 2 or 3 years, we have acquired an international standard for how to measure these underwater noises from these devices, because it's not that straightforward. We also in the US have some regulatory action thresholds. Our National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, sort of the Marine Agency, has some thresholds for marine mammals, behavioral change, and also harm, hearing loss. And there is similar guidance from another US federal agency. These are the only ones we can find in the world, and we have found several other countries are using them. So we have a couple of tools here. So far, we have measured a number of turbines and wave energy converters, and they all fall below these guidelines. So that's sort of heartening. And again, we have our dashboard here. And although there is still considerable uncertainty, we have a much lower sense of the risk involved here, down in the light green. When we think about electromagnetic fields or EMFs, these are produced by power export cables going from the devices to shore, certain other parts of the devices. And these can be disturbing but to certain marine animals, but only certain ones have electro or magnetosensitive organs that allow them to detect these. These are concerns for certain elasmobranchs like skates and rays. There are certain invertebrates, often important commercial ones like crab and lobster, that can detect these fields, and certain fish species. So what do we know? For both marine energy and offshore wind, power cables are likely to be buried or shielded as they run along the seafloor. And this is not 100% true everywhere, but it is generally true. So this really allows not the field to be damped so much as to physically separate the animals from the actual cable so that there is a diminished field with distance. So that's kind of helpful. We also have a whole series of lab and field studies that show that there is unlikely to be harm at the kinds of levels we're talking about. As we go to much larger arrays and more energy is moved, perhaps this will be become more of an issue. We have no thresholds, we have no standardized methods of measurement, but based on these studies, we consider this to be a relatively low risk, and there's a need to share that information, continue to model and validate models with field data. And this applies, as I say, probably even more to offshore wind because there is much more power moved than from wave or tidal devices. Changes in habitat. We've been concerned about impacts to both the benthic and pelagic habitats, and this can happen from a variety of reasons. Cable laying for wind or marine energy tears up the bottom for a period of time. The footprint of a device, be it anchors, a device set on the bottom, a tidal or a wave device set on the bottom. Obviously, there is some loss of habitat and change of habitat beneath and around that. You may get scouring because of currents focusing around some of these installations. You will certainly get settling of benthic organisms, so-called biofouling, on almost anything you put in the ocean. This is not really an environmental issue, but it's certainly an issue for maintenance and operation of the devices. And as soon as you put devices in the water, there will be fish shoaling or reefing around it, which isn't really, again, a mechanism of harm. It's simply an observation. There may be a whole series of indirect effects if we have devices in the water over decades, where we may have changes in food webs, and it has been theorized that non-native species could be introduced by these routes, although to date there has not been a study that's been able to show that. So where are we with habitats, changes in habitats? Well, luckily, the effects from these devices and these cables and so on really isn't different than other offshore industries. We have lots of examples of oil rigs and docks and pilings that give us indication of what those effects might be on populations. So the bottom line is we need to site these devices properly, avoid the important or unique habitats. Don't put your turbine down on top of the only rocky reef in an area, so on. So we call this a pretty low risk, and there's a need to really share that information. Changes in oceanographic systems. Now, again, this is applicable largely to marine energy, especially tidal, but also wave. The idea that you put a device down on the bottom, you are going to change some flow. As you take energy out, you may change the way that the flow works even more. You may cut off wave height. I know that some surfers early on had great concern until they learned that we were talking about perhaps millimeters of change. We may change sediment patterns and eventually maybe even ecosystems. However, for small numbers of devices, which is what we focused on largely because that's what we have evidence for, these changes are too small to measure. They are less than the natural variability of the system. So we rely on computer models, on numerical hydrodynamic models to look at change. And these modelers, of course, put in many, many turbines or many, many wave energy devices because it's boring not to see any change. And we start to see change in terms of tens, hundreds, and thousands of these devices, which I strongly suspect will never be deployed. However, it's also important to note these models have never been validated. So based on where we are with these small numbers of devices, we consider this to be a very low risk. And we need to continue to improve our models. We need to look towards the larger arrays and share our information. Okay, the last stressor I want to mention is this encounters with mooring lines and cables. The concern is if you have a wave energy device at the surface or perhaps a floating wind platform, it must be anchored with mooring lines, sometimes at great depth. In addition, within an array, you will have inter-array cables draped between the platforms. And the concern is that large marine mammals in particular could become entangled or enmeshed. The reason for these concerns are based on loose fishing gear, which are a risk to marine mammals and kill many marine mammals every year. Once upon a time, we also did a very poor job of putting in early submarine cables and had big loops in them and also resulted in whale deaths. We stopped doing that 100 years ago, but loose fishing gear continues to be a real concern. So this is where this issue has been raised by many, many stakeholders. So what do we actually know? The encounters with moorings and cables in a marine energy or offshore wind farm are very different. There's no loose ends to wrap around. Those cables and mooring lines are way too tight, too taut in order to create a loop. So we consider this to be a very low risk. And this is just kind of fun. I did this with one of my postdocs for a federal agency. This is a little snippet out of a video we did. The whole thing is down there on the URL on the right. But what you're looking at is where is it? An aerial view of a wind farm. And these are from the top what the mooring cables look like. And as we go to a side view, you see those mooring cables down very deep in the ocean. You also will see an inter-array cable there, and you begin to get the sense of how deep this is and how big these are. And the whale, a humpback mother and calf, are also in this frame, and you see how tiny it is. I'm going to play that again. It's kind of fast. Let me just play it again quickly. So we've been able to convince many of the stakeholders with great concern here that it really is a matter of scale, and the likelihood of this interaction of any sort being dangerous is tiny. And there's the little tiny whale. Wait a second, wait for it. The whole video is 3 or 4 minutes long, so you can go in and watch it, but there's the whale. So we consider that to be a pretty low concern. Whoa, I don't want to play that again. Okay. All righty, so what are we doing about this? Yeah, there we go. What are we going to do about this? What do we do with all this information we have? We have tried to put together a systematic way of approaching how to use this scientific information to advance the industry. We think that it appears the overall risk to marine animals from marine energy devices and offshore wind is very small, with the possible exception of the collision risk, which is still a tough one. But we think there are some principles that need to be followed. At the moment, regulators are asking for a great deal of data collection and analysis prior to putting even a single device in the water. That often is way out of whack with how risky it is. So we really are trying to encourage that data collection for consenting be proportionate to the risk. In order to do that, you need to understand the risk. And the second principle is we need sufficient evidence of that risk for regulators to rely on. And that really comes to us, the research community, to provide that kind of evidence. The third principle is we need to be able to use data and information from other projects, from research studies, from analogous industries, and transfer that information to new projects so that we are not starting from scratch in every instance. And finally, we need to retire risks that aren't significant. By this, we mean we're not killing them. They're just going into retirement so that they don't need to take the focus, but rather we can really concentrate on those risks that are real. And many of those retired risks can be revisited as we go to larger arrays or new information becomes available. So how are we trying to operationalize this? We've started with a process we call data transferability. And this is very much trying to take information from already consented projects, from research studies, and so on. We recognize whenever we talk to the regulatory community that some site-specific data will probably always need to be collected, but hopefully not as much if you can use data from elsewhere. However, to do this appropriately, you have to know that the data you are transferring were consistently collected, that they really are comparable. And that's what we've sort of focused on. We've worked a great deal with the regulatory community in the US and other countries to really get them to see if they would accept this, would they find this useful, and so on. And one of the first things we heard was, yeah, I could use data from elsewhere, but I don't know how to find it. So along the process, we developed this matrix, monitoring data sets, discoverability matrix, horrible mouthful. The idea is that it is an organized database of existing information that is searchable, looking at the stressors, which you've already heard about, and allowing the user to go in and find what's needed. So how does it work? The user would pick a stressor, first of all. Are you interested in underwater noise? Are you interested in collision risk? A receptor group. We won't necessarily have every species, but are you interested in seals or small whales or diving birds? Site conditions need to be similar. Is it a narrow, deep channel? Is it an open coastal channel? What do the sediments look like? And so on. The technology type, it could be tidal, it could be wave, it could be a floating tidal, it could be a bottom-based tidal, because they do have different risk profiles. And finally, project size. At this point, we're talking about very small projects, 1, 2, 3 devices, but eventually we hope to have enough information to really cover the array scale as well. So this matrix has been filled with these data sets, and the user can filter and sort this information by these characteristics. Okay, so you've got this, what do you do with it? Getting to risk retirement. Now, this is a term that's been thrown around by the industry for quite a long time, but no one kind of knew what it meant. We have defined it to be that for certain interactions, small numbers of devices, you don't need to fully investigate every interaction, but rather you can use information from existing sources. It doesn't replace or contradict any regulatory process. We have been working on 4 of these as OES environmental: underwater noise, EMF, changes in habitat, and changes in oceanographic processes. We've developed this kind of colorful look. You don't need to pay a lot of attention to the detail process, starting at the left that explains what kind of information you need. And as you step through each of the risk levels, you can understand where you can decide that there is no longer risk. That's the little downward arrows, sort of the off ramps off a highway. And this starts with, do you have enough data? Do you need to collect more data? Do you need to mitigate, et cetera? And as you progress towards the right, if you get all the way to the black arrow at the end, you can't define it as a low risk. You can't mitigate that risk. It tells you that perhaps that project needs to be resited or abandoned. And the data transferability is we're trying to represent by these little dotted lines, places where existing data sets can be brought in and brought to bear. Okay, so nice theory. What have we done about this? We have created evidence bases based on research papers, monitoring reports, and other documents. We have focused again on these small numbers of devices, not larger arrays. We have taken this evidence to a series of workshops with subject matter experts for underwater noise, EMF, and habitat changes. We're just working on oceanographic systems now. And all this information is up on THESIS. You can go and browse these very large evidence bases that have a great deal of many papers and short abstracts out of them with the evidence. So this is where we are right now. We have looked at risk retirement for underwater noise. We have been able to consider that, that standard, that specification for measuring, and we have the regulatory guidance from the US as sort of a little bit of a red line. The consensus we got out of our expert workshops was that this risk can be retired for small numbers of devices, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 devices, and that to date, because all the measurements have been from turbines and wave devices have fallen below that action level for the US, that gave the subject matter experts confidence in this. They also identified knowledge gaps. We still don't understand how animals really react to underwater sound. And as we go to larger operations, large arrays, we don't understand in these high energy areas how noise will propagate and what levels will come out of it. So the recommendations out of this particular retirement are to continue to record new types of devices as they're deployed. And there was a strong emphasis on the fact that the test centers around the world, besides testing the engineering capabilities of be it marine energy or wind or everything else, have to be centers that collect environmental data as well. And that has not generally been the case. So it was a strong shout out there. When we looked at electromagnetic fields, remembering there's no standards, there's no regulatory action levels. The consensus of the experts was that this risk can be retired for small numbers of devices and arrays because the level of power carried by wave and tidal devices is small. Now, the amount of power carried by offshore wind is higher, just bigger megawattage. And that probably needs to be looked at a little more, especially as we get to very big arrays. But at the moment, it still seems to be within a pretty safe level. The knowledge gaps are really, we need to continue to collect information to validate the models. Fortunately, modeling electromagnetic fields, if you know the right parameters, is pretty straightforward. We need to validate those models, and we need to think ahead to where we have more electrical infrastructure offshore, like substations and so on. The recommendations out of this one was, we do not have a database, a lookup table where you can determine the electromagnetic field emissions based on the cable configuration and the power load, which seems amazing. There should be a book, right? And my lab's actually undertaking this to do this summer, to start to do that, just create that lookup table. Okay, those are the, well, I'm missing one. I keep skipping, sorry. Okay, the third one what we've followed is habitat change. And we've, of course, realized this is similar effects to offshore development. And the consensus from the experts was that this risk can be retired for small numbers of devices for marine energy. And I think the same really holds true for offshore wind, whether it is bottom-based or the anchors from floating wind. Some of the knowledge gaps, we have had very few devices decommissioned in the ocean, at least marine energy or offshore wind devices, and we really don't know what kind of effects that will have on the benthic habitat. The only one, to my knowledge, that's been decommissioned was in the tidal device in Strangford Lough in Northern Ireland. And most countries, if not all, require that everything be removed from the environment. Fortunately, in Strangford Lough, they were able to work with the Northern Ireland regulator and cut it off at the sediment level, because it was determined that ripping the pile and everything up would have made far more damage to the environment. But we don't know these things. We need to think ahead to it. We still need to keep an eye on this non-native species introductions. Hasn't been shown yet, but it could be. And strangely enough, we don't understand colonization in tidal environments to speak of at all. So the recommendations were that careful siting of devices is needed. And this was an interesting set of experts because they were researchers, many of them, and they had many research interests, but admitted they aren't really needed for consenting. So it's an important point to separate what is an interesting sort of a need to know versus a nice to know for this industry. Okay, so to summarize this, risk retirement data transferability should help regulators access available data, support their consenting decisions, and really focus on the real risks. Right now, we think underwater noise, EMF, and habitat change, we can provide the information to them to allow them to move consenting forward very smoothly. There are remaining knowledge gaps, and we have to work on some of the other stressors, and most notably collision risk, which is the really, really hard one. Okay, so there's one more piece of this I have to go through with you. We have created these scientific evidence bases. We have brought the experts in. We have determined scientifically what we believe is going on, but we're trying to make these accessible to regulators. So we have developed we are in the process of developing what we've called guidance documents to try to bridge the scientific evidence to regulatory use, making that information accessible. We have provided guidance that we think at the top level fits pretty much every nation's regulatory schemes. Recognizing again, this doesn't replace any regulation or national guidance. We have 3 different types of these guidance documents: a generalized one, a country specific, and a stressor specific. So how does all this work? There are 4 bins that we have put all these regulations and scientific evidence into that we think is covered pretty much by all countries. The first, countries have some kind of regulation, statutes, etc., that look at species and populations at risk. There is something around habitat alteration or loss, something on an aerial or a spatial aspect. Effects on water quality, and then effects on social and economic systems. We have yet to find anything that falls outside those bins, but we're always looking and always interested to hear. So these 2 slides are horrible, horrible looking. This is our process. Go back again. The only thing I want you to note here is we have thought about this as it starts at project scoping, when the developer and the regulator first sit down to talk about what has to happen in an application for a permit or a license. How would they go about finding the right information? How is it accessible? How do you understand that information? And then later on, when an application is actually submitted, this comes in again for the regulator to really be able to retrieve those data sets from the matrix, determine whether there is adequate information upon which to make a decision, determine if more data need to be collected, and finally reach a decision. So this is not telling any regulator what to do. We hope it's just a help. The guidance documents we're working on right now, we have written 2 background documents, a description and framework. These are not extensive. Those ones are about 8 or 10 pages a piece. The stressor specific documents, we've written electromagnetic fields and underwater noise in draft, working on 2 others. Those are 2 to 4 pages. On the country-specific documents, we have drafts for the US and for Wales, and waiting on ones from other countries. And again, those run about 4 pages. So we're not trying to inundate regulators and others with huge volumes of information, but rather something quite succinct that will allow them to access the right resources. Okay, so I got to wrap up here. So what are we doing from here? What is OES Environmental trying to do? We are going to follow up on this risk retirement with the oceanographic systems, hopefully make some progress on collision risk. And then at that point, we are going to probably take on a number of other topics which are yet to be determined. We will continue the international outreach, engagement, sharing of data and information, and really looking for research gaps and how we can help to fill those. We run series of workshops and conferences, obviously all online this past year. Webinars as well, expert forums, which is a process by which we bring selected experts together from different countries who are working on a similar technical challenge. Just a quick example there, the first one we ever did, when you use active acoustics, echo sounders and so on, to look at fish in these high energy areas, say around tidal areas, the top and bottom of the water column are usually very messy because of this energy. And we had 3 different groups from 3 different countries looking at ways to clean those data. And they got together and actually managed to come out with some consensus of ways that would work. No one agreed, but there was consensus. We are also starting to work more in tropical areas in the Southern Hemisphere, because honestly, to date, we've been very Northern Hemisphere and temperate biased. And so we really are looking to work in that area more. And Australia is obviously our poster child for the Southern Hemisphere, and with great stuff going on here. We are continuing to work very closely with regulators, because if we want to get devices in the water, we really do need to get the regulatory community to understand what we know, what we don't know, and how we can move forward with minimal risk to the environment, but still have an industry. And finally, in 2024, we'll be writing another State of the Science report. So that's really it. I just want to point out I'm here talking with you, but this is the work of many, my team at PNNL. We have our 16 OES environmental representatives, and this is a collaborative project. It cannot be done by a single nation, a single group. We will do so much better if we not only collaborate, but really find the commonalities and the differences in what's going on in these countries. And I've been really honored to date to be able to be sort of in the middle of that. So that's been absolutely wonderful. So I want to, at this point, just say thank you very much for listening. I'm really pleased to be here, and I would love to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and we're glad to hear you want to answer questions, because there's a few that have come in.
Great.
So one of those, I'm given that there's no upvoting quite yet, I'm just going to read from top to bottom. So Evan Gray's asked, how does the acoustic noise from marine energy devices compare to that from shipping?
What a great question. Shipping on the whole is much, much louder. We have on a number of times had experiments out trying to listen to marine energy devices. And as a ship goes by, everything is just drowned out. We have made this point to regulators. And what we usually get back is yes, but well, two answers. Shipping is much noisier, but it's transient, whereas these things are sitting in place making noise. And shipping is generally grandfathered into any kind of regulatory process. And these devices aren't, but no, it is much, much less noise than, I didn't have time to show you all the evidence on but we do have quite a number of soundscapes of these devices where you can hear individual chains rattling and so on, but they're very, very low amplitude.
Great, thanks. Marie Fudge has asked, what triggers do you consider necessary or relevant to review risk retirement? Is it when new modelling comes in, the scale of the intervention grows? And how does that affect where you put it on the dial too? Can you see things go back up? That's
a great set of questions. So what our hope is with risk retirement is that you can really use this kind of process right from the start. The first time a developer talks to a regulator and says, I'm thinking of applying to put a device in here. So we think it's incredibly important for both the regulator and the developer to review what that information already is. And that's what I hope we're providing a simple process for. As far as where you retire the risks, that's obviously more of an art than a science. That is why we brought together the groups of experts to say, do you see this as a risk? Do you see this as something that is likely to have impact on individual animals, populations, et cetera? So it's not that exact. And as far as this last question, with new information coming in, you absolutely could decide that the risk level goes up. We want to be very open to any new information. And as I say, when we go to big arrays versus small numbers, we're sure that will trigger new information. May lower risks, may raise risks.
Cool, thanks. I'm going to personally upweight a question that's just come in because I also am interested in this answer. I'm interested in all the answers, but this one in particular. Have the guidance documents been tested on specific environmental applications, or indeed the whole risk retirement process is my part of the question, and in any jurisdictions, and if so, to what effect?
Great question. We are just on the cusp of Scotland has used some of the risk retirement and data transferability processes already. The guidance documents are really in draft and haven't been used yet. We will be presenting to the overall consenting board in Wales in a few weeks. And while it hasn't been used on specific processes, on specific applications, it is our hope that they will be taking these on board and recommending them to their regulators and advisors. So no, we're on the cusp, I think, but we haven't done this yet.
Thanks. There's a couple here that are on the same theme, so I'm just going to read out one of them that kind of covers both. How much of this is actually applicable to small island nations, developing countries like Indonesia, like the Pacific Islands and stuff? How feasible is it to do it in those countries?
A great question, and very near and dear to my heart, because I am leading the blue economy, small uses of marine energy process in our lab as well. I think they're very applicable, and we are just starting to look at that. I have this sense that when you go to a small, say, island nation, and you don't need massive wind turbines, or you don't need to produce megawatts of power, probably these environmental interactions will be lower as well, though I think we need to prove that. And so to some extent, I think that bar for being able to retire risks might be easier as you get to smaller devices, smaller footprints, smaller EMF. But that's yet to be proven. And that's something we're going to start to look at, I think, in the next year or so.
So
incidentally, we are also starting to look at OTEC, ocean thermal energy conversion, not applicable to all of Australia by any stretch of the imagination, but many of the tropical islands, we think small OTEC is another, not the big, huge billion-dollar sort of things, but the small things, and probably has a very small environmental footprint.
Cool. Thank you. So Martin has asked one that's getting a bit of attention, which is the diagram showing the whales. That was really cool. He can't remember where he saw this, but he's sure that he attended a presentation where it was said it is a problem for whales. So that touches on a question I had. So what are some of the myths around this? You know, why is this the conflicting views coming out?
We were asked to do that video, and it's not just a cartoon. It was based on a great deal of looking at dives. We picked a I'll tell you where it comes from, but I'll tell you why we did it first. That is based on a humpback mother and calf, because we thought it was the biggest, most vulnerable group of whale individual, as it were, going through a wind farm. We were asked to do it by the federal agency because every stakeholder meeting they went to, someone raised this and was extremely concerned about it. I had told them my sense was it's about scale. And so we did this, and everything that you saw in that video and the longer video is absolutely to scale. We had the wind industry developers look at it and make little adjustments and so on. So we feel it's fairly realistic. I think the myth still comes because of the sense of what happens with fishing gear. On our coast, the Pacific coast of the US, we have major whale deaths every year from fishing gear, as they do on most coasts. And that is the sense, if you have lines in the water, this will happen. So I don't know how we prove it until we have more out there. You're trying to prove the negative, but I really think it's a stakeholder myth, and it's around fishing, fortunately.
Thanks. So Brendan has asked, in identifying the gaps in risk knowledge, as it relates to each example you've provided, are there currently any incentives for experts to actually get on and collaborate with you? And are there key disciplines that you're really after, or ones that you're missing?
Oh, great question. I think that there is nothing I showed you that we couldn't learn more in. The one that, as I say, it bothers me the most is this idea of collision risk. And what we've been doing, obviously we need marine mammal people and fish people and so on. We have also engaged a number of engineers trying to think about, first of all, if we can identify parts of a device that are most dangerous, how do you change that design? But also, could you outfit turbine blades with stress detectors of some sort so that you actually know if there's ever been a hit? Because you may never observe it, even if you have cameras down 24/7. So I think we need all that. We really are starting to look heavily at machine learning for processing video, because I had a couple of interns that spent about 1.5 person years staring in a darkened room, staring at video of fish going by a turbine. And we can't do that very often. So there's a range there. All that said, I think that we need to be looking not just where we are now, we're trying to sort of nail that down, but as we move to big arrays in the future, we may be starting to create some problems over long-term ecological scales that we don't know about. And we need to look at it in the context of climate change, which frankly we haven't. So That wasn't a very good answer disciplinarily, but it's all of that.
So everybody should get involved.
It's everybody.
James,
and education and outreach specialists. Boy, talking to regulators, talking to stakeholders, unbelievably important.
Yep, I'd have to agree with that one. James Thompson has asked, has there been many studies into the effects of MRE devices on sediment changes for offshore islands and reefs rather than along coastlines?
Great question. Not a lot at all. It's funny because this is something where we find there is big differences among nations. In the UK, they've been putting in tidal devices in what I would consider quite shallow waters, like 30 meters or so. And there's been a lot of, if you go up to those northern Scottish islands, there's a fair number of, again, they're modeling studies, but looking at changes in sandbanks nearby and so on. But that's about the closest. There has been a real dearth of this kind of information at the blue economy scale, at the small remote community and island community scale. I think that is a real gap in knowledge to the previous question, really scaling. One of the things our laboratory is doing on the engineering side is trying to understand how you scale big wave devices we've been focused on down to produce a very small amount of power. And this whole extrapolation from larger to smaller, I think applies very much to the island nations, and it is a real gap.
Thanks. So we have time for two more, I think, but I'm going to squeeze them in. So Rodrigo Bustamante has asked, for the US setting, are these risk-based approaches actually embedded in any of the current regulatory laws? Otherwise, how do you get them operationalized?
That's a great question. Two answers there. We have laws, and I bet you do in your country as well, that say risk throughout them. There's risk this, risk that, but it's seldom defined and it's seldom operationalized. So there's not a lot of help in those kinds of past regulatory phenomenon. The other thing we find, and we find it in almost every country with the exception of maybe the UK, which did something about it a few years ago, the regulations that cover marine energy and offshore wind are very decentralized. In most cases, developers have to go to multiple agencies, multiple places to actually cover what they need to do for consenting and licensing. So we see that as the opportunity, that as these new regulatory structures are being formed, we are trying to see if we can get that embedded there. And that's what I'm kind of trying to encourage for, and developing nations, especially when they're just starting out in this kind of thing. I think it can really help.
So I'm going to squeak another one in before I ask the last question. So just follow up on that one. Given the oil and gas industry's been around for a long time, is it true that it has a more centralized approach then, or have they faced the same challenges? So is it just that we transfer the science that we've learnt from them around having infrastructure, or is there policy lessons as well?
I think there are some policy lessons there. In my experience, the oil and gas industry is a little more centralized, but they also have a great deal of money, and running around to all these agencies doesn't seem to bother them in the same way. In the US, you all might remember that Deep Horizon mess in the Gulf of Mexico. That uncovered a great many loopholes, shall we say, in oil and gas regulations. So I think it's mostly we can learn from them on the science side, maybe a little bit on the policy side, but I will say, originally, a lot of this regulatory capability was given to the same groups that were doing oil and gas regulation. My first offshore wind project I worked on was being treated rather like an oil and gas installation. And this is not a great thing because, shall we say, the capitalization of the industries is quite different.
That's an excellent point. So the last point in the Q&A is, have you seen changes in connectivity for fish and marine invertebrates with pelagic larvae, which I think gets to that question about whether the infrastructure could be stepping stones?
We haven't, because frankly, there hasn't been enough of these out in the water yet. The best place you could look at that is probably a few of the European nations that have had a lot of offshore wind in the water for quite a while. And there's been some studies in the North Sea, Belgium, Netherlands, and so on. There's a huge conglomeration right there in the southern North Sea. they have not seen, they haven't looked at larvae very much. There's a couple of studies, but they have looked at the habitat usage by a lot of fish. And of course, what's happening is they're creating a lot of artificial habitat, especially in quite a small area. So I think that's probably the first thing you've got to really understand, then start to look at the larval distribution. No, there's been a few modeling studies, I guess, but another great question.
Thanks, Andrea. So I think you're getting mass rave reviews on the chat from what I can see. While the CRC will upload a version of this webinar to its website and channel, is it true to say, from my memory, that a lot of these kind of presentations are also found on the TETHIS website?
Absolutely. If you go to TETHIS, up in the top, there's something called broadcasts, and there are webinars, workshops, conference outputs, etc. So there are a great many of those.
Yeah, cool, thanks. And there's been an offer from Alex Ogg to link up around the decommissioning side. So you're already getting the family growing, which will be terrific.
Great, wonderful. I'll look forward to that. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. And I think while we don't do too much of the clapping these days online, I think you're getting a wide clap around from everybody, Andrea. That was absolutely terrific. I'd just like to remind everybody that this wonderful webinar today was part of an ongoing series, and there'll be more in the coming months. So keep an eye out on the CRC website for some more webinars. I think there's some around some engineering questions and some policy questions that are coming up. But yeah, it's been great to have you on today, Andrea. That was absolutely terrific.